It was Christmas Day. The lights were glowing along the mantelpiece, the table was laid, and the whole family was gathered around me. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until my son-in-law, Jonathan, set down his fork, cleared his throat, and said, "I think it's time you both signed the house over to us. You can't keep managing it at your age." The room fell completely silent. My daughter, Charlotte, lowered her eyes. The relatives glanced awkwardly at one another. And Jonathan? Jonathan was smiling. It was a smile so full of arrogance that you'd have thought he already had the deeds tucked away in his own name. But there was one thing Jonathan hadn't accounted for. Tucked inside my jacket pocket that evening was a plain manila envelope. And inside that envelope was the one document that was about to turn his Christmas dinner into the most humiliating moment of his life. If you want to see how a man's arrogance can be stripped away in the space of a single minute, stay with me until the end. Because what happened that evening wasn't just a family dinner, it was a lesson, one that anyone needs to hear if they've ever mistaken an elderly couple's love for weakness. I won't give my own name in this telling, but I'll walk you through the evening exactly as it happened. My wife, Margaret, and I had spent our whole lives working for this house. It wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was 30 years of sacrifice poured into every wall. When we were young, we were up at 5 every morning, working 2 jobs between us, so that we could give our daughter Charlotte a good start in life and, one day, buy a home of our own. I still remember the first winter night we held the keys to this house in our hands. It was empty, the paint on the walls wasn't even finished, but our eyes were wet, happy tears. Margaret rested her head on my shoulder and said, "This is properly ours now." Charlotte was only 5 at the time, and she ran through the bare rooms laughing in that small, bright voice of hers. Those memories are still as vivid to me today as if they happened yesterday. We shaped every corner of that house with our own hands. The old dresser in the sitting room that Margaret's father gave us as a gift, it still stands there. The kitchen window where the morning sun used to fall straight onto Margaret's face while she made breakfast, that's still there too. Every brick, every wall, every door tells the story of what we built. Charlotte was our only child. We gave her everything we could, love, guidance, a good education. When she went off to university, that's where she met Jonathan. The first time he came to our house, he was terribly polite, very well-mannered. We thought Charlotte had found herself a good partner. I remember that first dinner Jonathan came to. He shook my hand with both of his and greeted me warmly, and all through the meal he complimented Margaret on her cooking. That night, after he left, Margaret smiled and said, "He seems like a decent lad. Charlotte's chosen well." I was pleased too. Neither of us had the faintest idea that this was the same man who would, years later, demand our house keys without a shred of shame. For the first 2 years after they were engaged, Jonathan left no stone unturned in making us feel valued. He was present at every occasion, respectful in every conversation. When Charlotte and Jonathan got engaged, Jonathan stood up in front of everyone and said, "I'll treat Charlotte's parents with the same respect I'd give my own." The whole family applauded. We were all so happy that day, we had no idea those words would one day ring completely hollow. But slowly, as time passed, we began to notice a change. 3 years into the marriage, Jonathan lost his job. We helped, without a single complaint, because Charlotte was our daughter and her happiness was ours. We covered their rent for months without letting Charlotte know how much of a sacrifice it was for us. Margaret sold some of her old jewelry to help them through it. We never told anyone, because we wanted to protect their dignity. But there's a difference between helping someone and erasing yourself for them, and Jonathan soon began blurring that line. At every family gathering, a new thread began creeping into Jonathan's conversation, comments about our age, about our health, remarks about how elderly people shouldn't be managing a house alone. At first, these comments seemed innocent enough, like genuine concern. He'd say things like, "Uncle, I noticed you were a bit out of breath on the stairs, you ought to be careful," or, "Auntie, a house this size must be difficult to manage on your own, isn't it?" Every time, we laughed it off, assuming he was simply looking out for us. But as time went on, his tone shifted. Comments that once sounded like questions began to sound more like announcements. One day, while we were sitting in the garden, Jonathan said, out of nowhere, "You two really ought to sell this place and get a smaller flat, you could live comfortably off the remainder." I brushed the comment aside at the time, but I noticed a flicker of concern in Margaret's eyes, something she'd perhaps sensed before I had. 3 months before that Christmas, Jonathan came round one afternoon and brought up estate planning. He said we ought to get our affairs organized so there'd be no confusion down the line. At the time, we assumed it was ordinary legal advice. But something in the way he said it left us both quietly unsettled. That day he'd brought a folder with him, filled with printed papers. He never showed them to us, kept them in his bag the whole time, but I caught a glimpse of the cover, which read, "Estate Transfer, Draft." When I asked what it was, he snapped the folder shut and said, "Nothing, uncle, just some paperwork from the office." I let it go at the time, but those words, estate transfer, lodged themselves in my mind like a splinter. That night, Margaret said to me, "I think Jonathan's got something else on his mind." I tried to reassure her, but the truth is, a dreadful suspicion had already taken root in me too. Our suspicions were confirmed when we learned that Jonathan had met with a property solicitor several times, without ever mentioning it to us. We found out quite by accident, when Charlotte, on the phone to someone, said, "Jonathan was saying the whole business with Dad's house is nearly sorted." Sorted? Since when had our home become a piece of business? I couldn't sleep that night. I sat alone in the sitting room, staring out at the frosty garden, turning it over and over in my head. Where had we gone wrong? Had we been too soft with Jonathan, let him believe our life's work was somehow owed to him? Or was this simply his own greed, quietly surfacing after all these years? Margaret found me sitting there and came to join me. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. I took her hand and said, "I'm thinking about how we gave our whole lives to this house, and now someone is trying to take it from us as though it means nothing." "We're not going to let that happen," Margaret said, and there was a steel in her voice I hadn't heard in years, the same steel from when we started our lives together with nothing. That night, Margaret and I decided we would quietly prepare. We sensed something was coming at Christmas dinner. But we said nothing to our daughter, because we wanted to understand exactly what Jonathan was planning, without frightening anyone. I rang our old solicitor, Mr. Whitfield, who had been a trusted friend of the family for 20 years. I told him the whole story, Jonathan's shifting comments, his meetings with a property solicitor, his constant references to the house. Mr. Whitfield told me the house was, in fact, registered solely in Margaret's and my name. There was no possible claim to joint ownership or inheritance Jonathan could make unless we ourselves chose to make one. But he also told me something else, that people attempting this sort of maneuver often apply emotional pressure within the family, hoping the elderly relative will cave before any proper legal steps are taken. These people, Mr. Whitfield said, often choose a public setting or a family gathering, so that out of embarrassment or a wish to keep the peace, the older relative won't say no. It's a calculated strategy. He told me about several old cases where elderly parents, wanting to avoid a scene in front of family, had signed away property documents on the spot, simply because they believed refusing would cause a row. Hearing this, my blood ran cold. It occurred to me that Jonathan might be thinking along exactly those lines. Mr. Whitfield gave me a piece of advice that changed the course of the whole story. If you believe something like this is happening, keep a copy of your original title deed close by, and if possible, make your ownership absolutely clear in front of the family, just once, and with the proof in hand. I took his advice to heart. Over the following fortnight, we went back through all our documents. Mr. Whitfield also told us a bit about Jonathan's solicitor, a Mr. Pierce, who was known within their professional circle. Apparently Mr. Pierce specialized in elder care matters and incapacity declarations, legal instruments used to have an elderly person declared unfit, in order to gain control over their property. Hearing that, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He wants to have us declared incapable," she said, her voice trembling. just for this house. I held her close and said, "We won't let them do that. I promise you." And so, in the days leading up to that year's Christmas dinner, I wasn't just preparing a meal, I was preparing to defend a lifetime's worth of work. The night before Christmas, I sat alone in my study with the original deed in my hands. I read it over and over, studying every word, as though I were seeing it for the very first time. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the whole story of our lives, written in the dry language of the law. That night, I told Margaret, "Whatever happens tomorrow, we stay calm. No shouting, no anger. We simply show the truth." Margaret nodded, but I could see in her eyes how it pained her that we had to prepare, in this way, to defend our own home from our own daughter's husband. Christmas morning arrived. The garden was dusted with frost, the fairy lights sparkled in the windows, and the house was filled with the smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon. Charlotte and Jonathan arrived at 10, along with my brother and his wife and their children. The first hour passed perfectly normally. The children unwrapped presents, the adults chatted, old memories were dusted off and shared again. My young niece, only 7 years old, came over and gave me a Christmas card she'd made herself, with a little drawing of our whole house on it, small windows and a big front door. I tucked the card close to my chest, thinking how this house wasn't just ours, it belonged to the whole family's memories. I noticed Jonathan seemed unusually quiet that day, as though he was waiting for something, working something over in his mind. He kept glancing at his watch, and his eyes kept drifting toward the bag he'd left by the front door. When the meal was served, everyone sat down. The turkey was carved, plates were filled, and conversation flowed, about work, the children's schools, plans for the coming year. My sister-in-law mentioned her son's new school place, and everyone offered their congratulations. For a little while, everything felt perfectly ordinary, perfectly festive. Then, quite suddenly, Jonathan set down his fork. He straightened his back, took a deep breath, and looked around the table as though he were about to make an announcement. "I think," he said, "seeing as we're all here together, this is the best moment to talk about something important." Charlotte glanced at him, startled. "Jonathan, now." "Yes, now," he said, pulling a folder from his jacket. "This isn't a bad thing, Charlotte. It's a necessary thing." He opened the folder on the table, documents headed, Property Management Agreement. My eyes fell on the papers and my heart stopped for a moment. But I kept my face perfectly composed. "Uncle, Auntie," Jonathan said, looking directly at us, "I know this might sound a bit odd, but we all know you're not getting any younger. This house is a great deal to manage, the upkeep, the bills, the maintenance, it's becoming too much for you." The room went completely silent. Even the sound of cutlery stopped. "I'm only saying," he went on, his voice taking on a false gentleness, "that if you sign the house over to us, we can look after it properly. You can go on living here, no worries at all, just have the paperwork put in our names." My sister-in-law set down her fork. My brother sat quietly, eyes lowered. Charlotte's face had gone pale. "Jonathan," Charlotte said softly, "this isn't the right time to bring this up." "No, Charlotte," he said, taking her hand, "this is exactly the right time. The whole family's here. Everyone's a witness." That was the moment I understood, Jonathan wasn't merely making a suggestion. He was applying emotional pressure in front of the entire family, as witnesses, so that we wouldn't feel able to refuse. He continued, raising his voice slightly. "Honestly, this isn't just a request. We've already spoken to our solicitor. Legally, if something were to happen, God forbid, there could be complications. Better to sort it out plainly, right now." "Complications?" Margaret asked, and for the first time there was steel in her voice. "What kind of complications, Jonathan?" Jonathan smiled, that same smile I'd seen before, brimming with arrogance. "Well, Auntie, you understand. Property matters can get complicated. And how would you know this house is a matter for you?" I finally asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Because, Jonathan said, spreading his hands across the table as though closing a business deal, in the end this is going to Charlotte anyway, isn't it? Better the process starts now, so there's no trouble down the line. And then he said the line that echoed through the entire room. I just need the keys today. I'll sort out the legal transfer myself. The room fell silent. Even the children had gone quiet, as though they too sensed something significant was happening. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. My young niece gripped her mother's hand, fear in her innocent eyes, as if she understood that this wasn't the Christmas it was supposed to be. I sat at the far end of the table, watching Jonathan. There was no shame in his eyes, no hesitation, only a cold, calculated hunger. I had known this moment was coming. I had sensed it months earlier. And yet, when it arrived, it still weighed on me. Watching my own daughter's husband try to take our home so openly, it was deeply painful. But I steadied myself. Because I knew I had something Jonathan didn't. The truth. Every eye in the room was on me now. Jonathan waited, tapping his fingers on the table, impatient for my answer. "Uncle," he asked, when my silence stretched on too long. "What are you thinking?" I rose slowly from my chair and walked out of the dining room, without a word. The room exchanged glances. Jonathan looked at Charlotte, as if to ask, "What's he doing?" I went into my study, where I'd already left that manila envelope, ever since the day Mr. Whitfield had given me his advice. For a few moments I simply stood there, holding the envelope, memories of every hardship and every joy Margaret and I had shared drifting through my mind. I took a deep breath, picked up the envelope, and walked back into the dining room. When I returned, every eye in the room turned to me. I set the envelope down on the table, directly across from Jonathan's folder. "What's that?" Jonathan asked, and for the first time there was a flicker of unease in his voice. "This," I said, opening the envelope, "is the one thing you never bothered to check." I laid the documents out across the table. At the top, it read, "Property title deed, sole ownership, in Margaret's name and mine." "This is the original deed to our house," I said, keeping my voice calm and clear. "Registered 20 years ago, solely in my wife's name and mine. No joint ownership. No conditional inheritance. No trust with your name anywhere on it. Just the two of us." Jonathan's face changed. That's fairly standard, Uncle. Before any inheritance planning." "No, Jonathan," I cut him off. "You've misunderstood. This isn't just a deed, it's the answer to a question you forgot to ask." I pulled out another page and placed it in the middle of the table. "Last month, I learned you'd met with a property solicitor, a Mr. Pierce, on 3 separate occasions. You were discussing family property transfer and elder incapacity clauses." The whole room fell into stunned silence. Charlotte turned to look at Jonathan, her eyes a mixture of shock and pain. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "is this true?" Jonathan stammered. "Charlotte, I was only thinking of all our futures." "No," I said, my voice firm but never raised. "You weren't thinking of our future. You were thinking of your own gain. And you assumed we were too old, too frail, to notice." I pulled out one more document, a printed email that had come from Mr. Pierce's office, the very solicitor Jonathan had been meeting, who turned out to be an acquaintance of an old family friend. In the email, Jonathan had written, "Given their age, I think we should begin the incapacity process to clear the way for the property transfer." I placed the paper in front of Jonathan. The room fell so quiet that only Jonathan's breathing could be heard. His face went pale first, then flushed red with shame. This has been misunderstood," he said, his voice shaking. "No, Jonathan," my sister-in-law said, speaking for the first time. "This is perfectly clear. You were trying to have us declared incapable, taking advantage of our age, just so the house would end up in your name." Charlotte stood up, tears streaming down her face, but there was anger in her voice now. "You lied to me, Jonathan. You told me this was just a suggestion for the good of the family. But you were trying to have my parents declared legally incapable. Charlotte, you don't understand. Jonathan reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. I stood at the head of the table, my voice steady. It's Christmas Day, Jonathan. You thought that today, with the whole family gathered, would be the perfect moment to shame us into handing over our home. But you made one mistake, you assumed old people are foolish. We're not. We simply have patience. Jonathan sat frozen in his chair, surrounded by a family that no longer had a single word of encouragement left for him. Look, he made one last attempt, his voice full of false apology. I only wanted things to be organized. I didn't wish you any harm. You didn't wish us any harm. Margaret said, her voice carrying a steel I hadn't heard from her in years. You tried to build a case declaring us incapable, purely so you could get this house in your name. This isn't a misunderstanding, Jonathan. This is a betrayal. My sister-in-law shook her head, her trust in him utterly broken. My brother stood and said, Jonathan, I've known you for years. I never imagined you were capable of something this low. Even the children now understood something terrible had happened, and their innocent eyes were fixed on Jonathan, as though they too felt his shame. Charlotte moved to the other side of the table, putting distance between herself and Jonathan. How long have you been planning this? She asked, her voice trembling. You lied to me too. You never even told me you were meeting a solicitor. Charlotte, please, let me explain. Jonathan stood and tried to move toward her, but she raised her hand to stop him. No, she said. Not now. Maybe not ever. Jonathan looked around the room for support, but no one was looking at him with any sympathy now. Everyone who had once sat quietly through his concern now understood exactly who he was. My niece's mother, who had always thought highly of Jonathan, quietly pulled her chair a little further away from him, as though distancing herself from his character. I took my place again at the head of the table and said, calmly, Jonathan, I'll give you one chance to salvage some dignity. Take your papers and leave this house. From today, until you own up to what you've done and deal honestly with this family, you are not welcome here. You're throwing me out. Jonathan said, astonished, as though he still couldn't quite believe his plan had failed. On Christmas Day? No, I said, my voice both firm and calm. I'm inviting you back, the day you learn to tell the truth. Today, you're removing yourself from this house, through your own actions. Jonathan gathered his folder, his hands trembling. He looked once more at Charlotte, but there was only despair in her eyes. She looked away. He walked silently toward the door. As he left, he turned back once, perhaps hoping someone would stop him, would speak up on his behalf. No one did. The door closed, and a peaceful quiet settled over the house, the kind of quiet that comes when a heavy weight has finally been lifted. Charlotte came to me and rested her head in my lap, weeping. Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I held her close and said, you've nothing to apologize for, love. You did nothing wrong. You were just as deceived as we were. That evening, the rest of the family stood by us too. My brother, always the quiet one, came and sat beside me and said, Brother, I've never seen you as brave as you were today. You never lost your temper, you simply showed the truth. That's a lesson for our children too. Hearing that eased something in my chest. My sister-in-law took Margaret's hand and said, You two gave your whole lives to this house. No one has any right to take it from you like that. Margaret nodded, eyes full of tears, and for the first time that whole day, I saw her smile just a little. That night, once everyone had gone, only the three of us, Margaret, Charlotte, and I, remained. We sat together and made tea, staying quiet for a long while, simply glad of each other's company. Sometimes words aren't necessary, just the presence of the people you love is enough. Later that night, Margaret and I sat in the sitting room by the fire, cups of tea in hand. Did we do the right thing? Margaret asked, her eyes carrying both exhaustion and peace. "We protected ourselves," I answered. "And we showed Charlotte that standing up for your dignity is never wrong, no matter who it's against." Over the following weeks, Charlotte separated from Jonathan. It wasn't an easy decision, but once she understood the full depth of it, that her own husband had tried to have her parents legally declared incapable, all for the sake of a house, there was no doubt left in her mind. During those weeks, Charlotte spent most of her time at our house. At first she was very withdrawn, lost in her own thoughts. One evening she asked me, "Dad, was I foolish not to see any of it?" I took her hand and said, "No, love. People who deceive succeed precisely because it's hard to be suspicious of someone you love. Your love wasn't your weakness, it was your virtue. Jonathan simply took advantage of it." Gradually, Charlotte began to find herself again. She threw herself into her work, reconnected with old friends, and one day told us she was thinking of moving into a small flat of her own, to start a settled, independent life. With Mr. Whitfield's help, we strengthened the deed further and set up a living trust to secure the property even more firmly. We learned that simply protecting what's yours isn't enough, it needs to be secured properly, legally, ahead of time. Mr. Whitfield also advised us to draw up an advance healthcare directive, clearly naming who would make decisions on our behalf should we ever need medical or mental health support, and we named my brother and a close, trusted old friend, not Jonathan. Making all these arrangements left me with a strange kind of sadness. These are things people usually settle calmly, in their own time, in their later years. But we had to do it hurriedly, under a shadow of fear, simply because someone we had considered part of our family wanted to take advantage of our love. For weeks after that Christmas day, an odd stillness lingered in the house. Charlotte had come to stay with us, and she barely spoke. One evening, over dinner, she suddenly put down her fork and began to cry. "I don't understand," she said, wiping her tears. "I spent 5 years with him. I trusted him completely. And he was using me the entire time, just to get to you too." I took her hand and said, "Using you wasn't his intention, at least not at first. But greed changes a person. Perhaps he did love you when you married. But over time, his greed outgrew his love. This isn't your fault." Margaret rested Charlotte's head on her shoulder and said, "We're all human, love. Sometimes we choose well, sometimes we don't. What defines us is what we do once the truth comes out. And you did exactly the right thing, you stood with the truth, however difficult that was." In those days, Charlotte reconnected with some old friends she'd lost touch with after the wedding. One of them, her university friend Amelia, turned out to be an enormous support. Amelia had been through a difficult relationship herself, and she helped Charlotte understand that being deceived doesn't make you foolish, it simply means you trusted someone, and trusting is never a weakness. A few weeks later, we learned that Jonathan had been telling a very different version of events to some of his friends, as though we had humiliated him for no reason. It stung at first, but we decided we wouldn't concern ourselves with anyone's distorted version of events. The people who had actually seen the truth, the whole family present at that Christmas dinner, knew exactly what had happened. As time went on, Charlotte made the decision to legally divorce Jonathan. It was a decision she reached carefully, with no haste at all. We supported her fully, but the choice was entirely her own. Mr. Whitfield put her in touch with a good family solicitor who guided her through it all, and whenever Jonathan's side made any attempt to claim property or money, our deed and all the documents we prepared in advance proved to be our greatest protection. One day, months later, Charlotte came to me and said, "Dad, do you remember when you brought out that envelope?" I was simply stunned at the time. But looking back now, I understand, that moment wasn't just about pulling out a deed. It was the result of your whole life's patience and wisdom. You understood what was coming months before it happened, and you prepared quietly, without hurting anyone. I smiled and told her, "Love, when someone builds something over a lifetime through hard work, it has to be protected not just with love, but with wisdom too. Love comes from the heart, but protection has to come from the mind." Looking back now, I realized this whole affair didn't just teach us how to protect our property, it taught us that real love never takes anything from you, it only gives. Anyone who asks something of you in the name of love, whether it's a house, money, or your dignity, isn't loving you. They're using you. We spoke openly about all of this with the rest of the family too, so that others might avoid falling into the same trap. My sister-in-law mentioned that something very similar had happened to someone she knew, but that person hadn't been so fortunate. They transferred their property in haste, and it took years of court battles afterward to get it back. Hearing that only deepened our gratitude that we had protected ourselves in time. We decided we wouldn't keep our story to ourselves, we would share it, so that others might learn from it too. Today, Charlotte is happy in her own life. She has her own small flat, she's been promoted at work, and she visits us often, not out of obligation, but out of love, freely. Every Sunday she comes for lunch, and the house has that same warmth it always used to have. A few weeks ago, the three of us were sitting together over tea when Charlotte smiled and said, "You know, looking back now, there's one thing I'm grateful for, that the truth came out when it did. If it had stayed hidden any longer, I think I'd have been hurt far more." Margaret took her hand and said, "There's always some good hidden behind every hardship, love. We just need the patience to see it." This whole experience taught us that growing older doesn't mean growing weaker. The more time passes, the more wisdom, patience, and understanding a person gathers. Anyone who assumes elderly people will be easy to deceive forgets that older people have seen a great deal in their lives, hardship, betrayal, and lessons of every kind. And that very experience becomes their greatest weapon, the ability to recognize the truth. If you're watching this and you ever find yourself in a similar situation within your own family, remember, silence isn't weakness, it can be part of wisdom. Take your time, keep your documents in order, and when the moment comes to speak the truth, speak it with complete calm and complete dignity, exactly as we did that Christmas evening. People often ask me when we first suspected something. When did we first sense that Jonathan had something else on his mind? Truthfully, that first moment was so small that, at the time, we barely gave it a second thought. It was the summer before that Christmas, roughly 6 months earlier. We'd held a small family barbecue in the back garden. Charlotte and Jonathan came along, and Jonathan seemed in good spirits all day. But as the evening wore on, while the two of us sat alone in the garden for a moment, he asked me a question that struck me as odd at the time. "Uncle," he said, eyes fixed on the grass, "have you ever thought about what would happen to this house if something happened to you both, God forbid?" I laughed it off at the time. "We're not going anywhere just yet, don't you worry." He smiled too and nodded, but there was a glint in his eye that unsettled me slightly. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, he was our son-in-law, and questions like that come up now and then. But looking back, I understand now that was the first seed planted, a thought that took root slowly in Jonathan's mind and grew, unnoticed, over time. A few weeks later, something else happened that, in hindsight, I can't believe we let slide. Margaret was away at a friend's wedding, and I was home alone when Jonathan turned up unannounced. He said he'd been passing by and thought he'd pop in and say hello. We sat in the sitting room with cups of tea while he began asking me a string of questions about council tax, how much we paid each year, what the current market value of the house was, whether we'd ever considered remortgaging. At the time, I assumed he was seeking advice for his own situation, since he and Charlotte had been talking about buying a place of their own. I answered honestly, told him everything, our property's value, our outgoings, all of it. Looking back now, I realize he was quietly gathering intelligence on our finances, working out exactly what the house was worth and what he stood to gain by claiming it. Taken alone, each of these little moments seems fairly innocuous. But strung together, they form a very clear picture, a man who had been planning this, quietly, patiently, for months, perhaps years, waiting for the right moment to make his move. There's another moment I remember that feels significant now. One evening, Charlotte came round on her own, without Jonathan. She seemed a little troubled. When I asked if everything was all right, she said, "Jonathan's been so busy lately. He says he's planning for our future, but he won't tell me the details. Every time I ask, he changes the subject." At the time, I didn't take much notice of that either, perhaps because I didn't want to believe that my own son-in-law, whom I'd come to regard almost as a son, could be plotting something against us. People often want to think the best of their own family, even when the signs are staring them in the face. But once we sat down with Mr. Whitfield and laid all these little pieces side by side, the full picture became clear. Every odd question, every unannounced visit, every vague comment about planning for the future, it was all part of a much larger design. There's something important I want anyone watching this video to understand: betrayal rarely happens all at once. It builds slowly, in small, quiet steps, so gradual you barely notice it until it has taken its full shape. If you ever notice someone asking unusually probing questions about your family's finances or property, particularly money or property, that's a sign worth paying attention to, not brushing aside. There's one more thing I want to share: the meeting we had with Mr. Whitfield 2 weeks before that Christmas. Margaret and I sat in his small office, and he confirmed that our deed was entirely sound, no legal issue whatsoever, but he raised a further precaution we hadn't considered. If Jonathan attempted to file for power of attorney or a guardianship application through his solicitor, he told us, it could turn into a long, distressing legal battle, even if you ultimately won. It's far better to have all your legal documents watertight before any such attempt is even made. He advised us to draw up an advance healthcare directive too, clearly stating who would make decisions on our behalf should we ever require medical or mental health support, and we chose, deliberately, my brother and a close old friend, not Jonathan. Making these arrangements left me with a strange kind of sorrow. These are the sorts of things people usually settle calmly, on their own terms, in their later years. But we were having to do it hurriedly, under the shadow of fear, simply because a man we had welcomed into our family wanted to take advantage of our love. For weeks after that Christmas day, an odd quiet lingered in the house. Charlotte had come to stay with us, and she said very little. One evening over dinner, she suddenly set down her fork and began to weep. "I don't understand," she said, wiping her eyes. "I spent 5 years with him. I trusted him entirely. And the whole time, he was using me, just to get to you too." I took her hand and said, "Using you wasn't his intention, at least not at the start. But greed changes a person. Perhaps he did love you when you married. But over time, his greed grew larger than his love. None of this is your fault." Margaret drew Charlotte's head onto her shoulder and said, "We're all only human, love. Sometimes we choose well, sometimes we don't. What defines us is how we respond once the truth comes to light. And you did exactly the right thing, you stood with the truth, however hard that was." During those weeks, Charlotte reconnected with a few old friends she drifted from after the wedding. One of them, her university friend Amelia, proved to be an enormous support. Amelia had been through a difficult relationship of her own, and she helped Charlotte understand that being deceived doesn't make you a fool, it simply means you trusted someone, and trust is never a weakness. A few weeks later, we learned Jonathan had been telling a very different version of events to some of his friends, as if we had humiliated him without cause. It stung, hearing that, but we decided we wouldn't concern ourselves with anyone's distorted retelling. The people who had actually witnessed the truth, the whole family present that Christmas evening, knew exactly what had happened. As the months passed, Charlotte made the decision to formally divorce Jonathan. It wasn't a decision she rushed into, she thought it through carefully. We supported her fully, but the choice was entirely hers. Mr. Whitfield put her in touch with a capable family solicitor, and whenever Jonathan's side made any attempt to lay claim to property or money, our deed and the documents we had prepared in advance became our greatest protection. One day, months later, Charlotte came to me and said, "Dad, do you remember when you brought out that envelope?" I was simply stunned at the time. But looking back now, I understand, that moment wasn't just about pulling out a deed. It was the result of a lifetime of your patience and wisdom. You'd understood what was coming months before it happened, and you prepared, quietly, without hurting anyone. I smiled and told her, "Love, when someone spends a lifetime building something through hard work, it needs protecting not just with love, but with wisdom too. Love comes from the heart. Protection has to come from the mind." Looking back now, I understand this whole affair didn't just teach us how to protect our property, it taught us that real love never takes from you, it only gives. Anyone who asks something of you in the name of love, whether it's a house, money, or your dignity, isn't loving you. They're using you. We spoke openly about all of this with the rest of the family too, so others might avoid the same trap. My sister-in-law mentioned something very similar had happened to an acquaintance of hers, though that person hadn't been quite so fortunate. They'd signed their property over in haste, and it took years of court proceedings afterward to reclaim it. Hearing that only deepened our gratitude that we had protected ourselves in time. We decided we wouldn't keep our story to ourselves, we would share it, so that others might learn something from it too. Today, Charlotte is happy in her own life. She has a small flat of her own, she's been promoted at work, and she visits us often, not out of any obligation, but freely, out of love. She comes for Sunday lunch nearly every week, and the house carries that same warmth it always used to have. A few weeks ago, the three of us sat together over tea, and Charlotte smiled and said, "You know, looking back, there's one thing I'm grateful for, that the truth came out when it did. If it had stayed hidden any longer, I think I'd have been hurt far more." Margaret took her hand and said, "There's always some good hidden behind every hardship, love. We just need the patience to see it." This whole experience taught us that growing older doesn't mean growing weaker. The more time that passes, the more wisdom, patience, and understanding a person gathers. Anyone who assumes elderly people will be easy to deceive forgets that they've seen a great deal in their lives, hardship, betrayal, lessons of every kind. And that very experience becomes their greatest weapon, the ability to recognize the truth when it matters most. If you're watching this and you ever find yourself facing a similar situation within your own family, remember, silence isn't weakness, it can be part of wisdom. Take your time, keep your paperwork in order, and when the moment comes to speak the truth, speak it with complete calm and complete dignity, exactly as we did that Christmas evening. That was our story, and I want you to know this, however difficult life may seem, truth and patience always win in the end. If you enjoyed this story, if you feel there should be more stories like this one that teach us how to protect ourselves, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Every comment, every like, gives us the courage to bring you more stories like this. See you in the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves, and never forget to stand up for your own dignity.